Hey now, Brawlers, it's time for another Board Game Brawl review with Nick Minahan, sponsored by BoardGameBliss.com. Hey folks, today we're going to take a look at Warhammer Quest, the adventure card game from Fantasy Flight Games. Now, I will say right up front that I did not ever play the original Warhammer Quest, which this game is very loosely based on. Warhammer Quest was like a Hero Quest type, I think it might have actually been the inspiration for Hero Quest, a game from Games Workshop back in, was it the 80s, I guess? It's a very old game and it's been long out of print. It was a cooperative game, dungeon crawling set in the Warhammer Fantasy universe. This is based off of that game, but of course, as the name implies, it is purely a card game. So, since I haven't played the original, I can't really speak to that, but I'm going to go ahead and assure you it's very different, based purely on the fact that it's a card game instead of a cooperative miniatures board game. In any case, what the theme is that you take control of these different sort of generic fantasy characters in the Warhammer Fantasy universe, and you are going down through different campaign modes through, I'll call them dungeons. Or actually, every step of the campaign is a different set of locations that you go through that may actually be dungeons, but it might be other types of areas, things like that, sewers and so on and so forth. You're trying to meet an objective. It's usually capturing a big bad guy and taking care of all of the random monsters you come across as you go through it, surviving different perils of the dungeon and so on. And if you decide to play the entire campaign mode, which you probably should if you're buying the game, you have different stops at the settlement in between where you can actually level up your character, so to speak, advancing them, making them stronger, getting them items, and so on and so forth. So it is like a dungeon crawling game, but in card game form. And of course, there are a few games that it is very similar to, including the most obvious one of all. We'll cover all of that. Let me go ahead and give you a brief look at how the game is played. Then we're going to come back. I'll let you know what I think. Alright, I'm going to give you a brief look at Warhammer Quest, the adventure card game. Now, the way that Warhammer Quest is structured is that you can actually go on a bunch of different quests. And in fact, there's a long campaign made up of, I believe it's 5 different campaigns. And there's something called a Delve mission, which is like an extra add-on mission you can go on after you finish the main campaign. The one that I have set up out here now is the first step in the campaign, and that is a foul stench, which should get you very excited. Now, I don't think that this game is really like something you need to worry about spoilers, because they're kind of generic missions to a degree, but for the purposes of not risking that, I'm just going to go through the first scenario, which is basically just there is this nasty goblin called Odious Grump who is like poisoning the water supply or something like that of the city that the game is taking place in, and you and your adventuring friends need to get to the bottom of it. So a lot of the game has to do with setting up the game based on the particular quest card. On this side of the card, you'll have the setup where you actually tells you how to build all of the different decks. You have a dungeon deck, the gear deck. You're gonna usually for those you're just gonna take a random number of cards. In this case, it's 12 and 12 for this particular scenario. Then you're going to build the monster deck. The monster deck is actually a bit more complicated. It's going to tell you to use a certain number of monsters based on different tiers, and then you're going to have to take you'll take specific enemy sets, you'll take some random ones, and so on. We'll get into what the different enemies are in a little bit. As part of that setup, you're also going to have to put out enemies. This should actually be turned this way. Some of the enemies are going to spawn right away based off locations, which is another thing you need to set up. For this particular scenario, you're going to have 3 random locations of the level 1 tier, and then a specific location keyed into the Nemesis being Odious Grump. That's a specific type of card you keep separate from the other monsters, and he also has Nemesis locations. So for his, it is something Sump that is the main location, and that's going to be on the bottom of the randomized locations, and I actually put one out here right now, and that will tell you a little more about the setup. So actually, we'll go ahead and take a look at that right now because it's pretty relevant to the setup. Up in the top corner, we'll tell you a tier. This actually will link together with the tier up in the top corner of the quest card. So that will tell you whenever anything needs to be randomly chosen, you go off of whatever the tier number is to determine which ones you use. So in later scenarios, that tier is going to be either 2 or 3, representing more complicated and difficult location cards and monster cards that you're going to have to face. Every location has a little bit of story blurb and also has a special effect that may happen. In the case of the Lost Dwarven Forge, at the end of a location phase, one hero may suffer a wound in order to claim a success token. We'll get to all of that. In the bottom corner is the most important number on the card. That is the number of progress tokens you need to put on the location in order to solve it, so to speak, and move on to the next location, travel to the next location in the deck. In this particular scenario, you need to get to that last location and totally solve it in order to win the scenario. In the bottom corner are the spawn numbers. Now, the way that this is going to work, whatever the red number is with the skull, that is the number of active face-up enemies are going to engage the different players, starting with whoever is the leader for the round at the start of the round, and then moving back and forth. I have this set up for a 2-player game, by the way. And then the bottom number is how many enemies are going to start off in the shadows. When an enemy is in the shadows, it's put face down without looking at it near the quest card in the center of the table. These are enemies that have not yet engaged the adventurers, but they may and probably will. When you're finally done with all the setup, you'll actually flip this card over, and wow, look, there's a whole bunch of other stuff. There is quite a bit going on in the game, but it's not as complicated as you might think. Now, you're going to put this progress token, peril token is actually what it's called, and that's going to start off in the first spot, and at the very last thing you do in every round of gameplay is the peril phase, and that's going to keep moving down the track. When it gets to certain spots on the track of different colors, it's hard to tell, but this is actually blue, so there's a green, a blue, and a red here. The other ones are just neutral and nothing happens. But when it gets to green, blue, or red, you're going to have to resolve the actions of each here. And for this scenario, it's very simple. Every time that gets to one of those color spaces, Odious Grump is going to spawn and engage the heroes. And when you get to blue or red, if he's still out there, he heals back to full and engages them again. If you manage to kill him, quote unquote, he respawns on blue and red. Then at the bottom of the card is probably what you're most concerned about, and that is the victory and defeat conditions. Victory is if you go to Grump Sump, that's what it's called. If you fully explore Grump Sump, you get the reward that is listed on the other side of the sheet. And if all the heroes are defeated, you have to take the penalty, which, and I just flipped that token off, but for the reward, you'll have a story board and it says Odious, you add Odious Grump and 1 Legendary Fortune gear card to the campaign pool. We'll talk about that later. And for the penalty, you just add Odious Grump to the campaign pool. Alright, so actually what people were probably most concerned about, maybe I should have led with that, is the adventurers themselves. At the start of the game, each player, up to 4 players, and if you play solo, you have to play 2 adventurers, essentially, is going to choose a character. So out here, I have the Ironbreaker, who is a dwarf, and then I have over here the Bright Wizard, who looks like Chandra Nalar from Magic the Gathering. Now, in the top corner of the card, you have a little player count symbol. Depending on the number of players in the game, and again, this is a setup for a 2-player or solo game, you will use a different character card. Now, what's different about the character card is 2 things. One is the hit points. Less players means more hit points, obviously, for each of the characters involved in the game. But also, it'll have an effect on the number of actions that the players are going to get. When there are only 2 characters in the game, each hero gets to activate twice during the hero phase. If, however, for example, you had 3 players, one character, whoever is the leader for the rounds, is going to get 2 activations. Everyone else only gets 1. So it'll go first player and then go around. That first player is going to get another action, and then that's going to be the end of the hero phase. This is the first player marker, by the way. So whoever has that is going to take the leader action and lead off for the rounds, and that's going to pass to the other player at the end of the game. Excuse me, at the end of the round. Now, each character is going to have action cards. You'll start off with 4 basic action cards, and during the settlement phase, which we haven't covered yet, you may be able to swap these out for better ones later. And this is where we'll just go ahead and jump right into the game and explain how the games work. So during the hero phase, each player is going to activate depending on the number of activations that they get, starting with the leader, and you use one of your cards. Each of the basic actions has a different symbol on it, and every character has cards with all 4 of those symbols and types of actions, but they're all a little bit different even though they have the same idea. So for instance, every character has an attack card. For the Bright Wizard here, it's a fireball. But for the dwarf, it's called Inexorable Advance, and it does the same thing. It gets the job done as far as doing an attack, but it always functions a little bit differently. So the inexorable advance says that you can engage up to 2 enemies. Engaging an enemy says that you're actively fighting both of them, and then or you're putting them in front of you, and that is considered being engaged with them. And then the bottom part here for the attack says that it has 2 dice symbols, and then before this action you may target up to 2 creatures. Usually you can only target 1 enemy that's engaged with you. In this case you can target up to 2. And when you're rolling dice, you have character dice and you have the monster dice, if you could even see them. The character dice are the white ones and the black dice are the monster dice, of course. You'll roll a number of black dice equal to the number of monsters actively engaged with you, and then however many white dice the card tells you to roll, that's what you're going to roll, and you will roll them all together. Now, any claw symbol that comes up means that the enemies are going to attack you. Starting with whoever, if you only had one, if you have 2 claw symbols for 2 enemies, they're both going to attack you. If you only had one, you prioritize whoever is the stronger enemy. And then for your dice, so here's their attack damage. This is how much is going to be coming at you, even if you're able to kill them with this. For your dice, any of the crossed halberds that you have on the dice are going to be considered successes. So this is 2 successes. This is actually a crit. When you roll a crit, it counts as 1 success, and then in typical Games Workshop universe fashion, they explode. Meaning you roll the die again, and you can continually keep doing that with every crit coming up as a success. This, however, is a shield. A shield will cancel out 1 point of damage, not a whole attack, but a point of damage coming at you. So what you'll do is since both enemies attacked, you add up all their attack damage, that's 4. With the shield, you'll be able to eliminate 1 of those points of damage, but the rest is going to go onto your character sheet. Let's talk a little bit more about the enemies before we go back to the action cards. So each of the enemies, you'll notice that they have a different tier up in the top corner. Like I said, this is their attack power. This is their health. Now, if not always the case, but sometimes there actually is a number in the little inset circle there. That's their resistance. That is basically armor that negates a certain amount of damage before any other wounds can go through. So in order to wound this orc boy, which is an elite orc boy, by the way, that's why it's a red card. There's a normal orc boy that's actually by coincidence over on the Bright Wizard that is a little bit weaker. The health is not as good and the damage is not as good. But in any case, the elite orc boy here, you would need to deal 2 wounds just to get a wound through to deal to him. So in other words, if you wanted to kill him all at once, you'd need to deal 4 wounds at once because one of those is automatically going to get negated. Now, they all have special abilities. First off, there's these keywords underneath it. You have to resolve those first. Advance simply means that if, for instance, he was in the shadows, he would advance towards whichever hero is activating him. We'll get to that. Whereas the gigantic spider here has multiple keywords you have to resolve from left to right. Inflict means it deals its damage. Ensnare is its own special ability that says that it might exhaust one of your actions because it's a spider, I guess. And then retreat means he actually goes back into the shadows after he gets done with his engagement phase. This doesn't happen right now. I'm just going through the keywords. We'll explain when all that stuff happens, because when you just attack, they just get to do the little counterattack here, but you don't resolve anything else quite yet. There's other cards with other types of things. So, for instance, there's a lot of different enemies. I can spend a long time going through them. But a Knight Goblin Archer, you see, is pretty weak, but he also has a retreat ability. He actually inflicts twice after he retreats, because he is basically doing ranged attacks. But again, none of those abilities are going to happen quite yet. Now let's talk about the rest of the actions before we get to the enemy phase. So you have the attack action, which we just already covered. But then you also have we'll cover that one last. You have the explore action. This is how you're going to get progress tokens onto that location and be able to move on past it. And again, they're all different for every player. So Into the Dark for this dwarf says that you roll 2 dice to explore, and successes are always for whatever they're doing. So successes for the attack card mean you're dealing damage. Successes for the explore card mean you're putting more tokens out onto the explore card itself. And then his special ability is that whenever you explore with whatever card for any player, you have to draw a dungeon card. But in this case, he gets to look at that card and perhaps exhaust an action to stow it under the deck and do another one. Let's go ahead and look at a few of those dungeon cards and what they might represent. They have this lantern on the back of them, and they're either going to help you or hurt you. In many cases, hurt you, but there's quite a few good ones as well. So, for instance, this is a bad one, the Lurking Foe. You spawn an enemy face down into the shadows from your created deck. The hidden passage, on the other hand, you roll 2 hero dice, and for each success you can progress a location. If you roll at least 1 crit, you also get to claim a gear card, so that's a strictly good card. The Shrine is also a good one. You may exhaust an action to recover a wound and to claim a success token. Now, that's a good point we should talk about. There are success tokens in the game. These are tokens you can use in order to put onto one of your action cards. The next time you activate that action card, that success counts as another success for whatever you're trying to do. Whether it's hurt the enemy with the damage, or to put another token onto the location card, whatever it is, you add it to whatever you're also getting from your dice. I should mention these, however, are the progress tokens that you put onto the location card. They look different, but they're the same premise. There's 1s and 3s. Other types of cards. Every time that you use one of these cards, by the way, you are going to exhaust it. You're going to tap it sideways, something very important to note. You have the Stubborn Resolve card here, which is his form of the Rest card. When you rest, this is your way of rolling dice and hoping to get successes in order to heal yourself up. For the Dwarf, he actually gets to potentially exhaust a non-nemesis enemy that's engaged with him, and then he also gets to give himself 2 shields in order to prevent damage from this action, because no matter what the action is, if there's enemies engaged with you, you still need to roll those black dice. So even trying to rest heal could be deadly if you've left enemies in front of you. Now eventually you're going to run out of cards because you're going to use all of them, and at any time you can choose to use your refresh card. Every character has 1 card that has a refresh symbol on it. It's going to be different for everyone. So for instance, the Dwarves is his shield wall, which is his aid card, which is all about helping people. When you choose to do the aid action, you will roll the number of dice it indicates, and you'll be able to give for every success tokens, up to 2 of them per card, to your allies. So I can say, well, I'm going to aid you with your rest card, so I'm going to roll dice, see how many successes I get, and put those tokens onto your rest card. That's what aid is. And for him, if he takes that action, he gets to refresh all of his cards. That's how he's going to get all of his actions back. But for the Bright Wizard, hers is actually the Burning Sight. Even though there's a picture of a dwarf dude here. I don't know what's going on there. But so for hers, you notice that her Explorer is very different. She rolls just 1 die. She then draws and does a dungeon card, but then she may also suffer 2 wounds to claim extra successes for that card. And then because this happens to be her refresh action, she gets to refresh all of her actions. And all of her things are going to be different than the dwarves. In fact, a lot of the Bright Wizard's cards have to do with giving herself extra damage, like blood magic, in order to give herself more successes, or to give her even her opponents more successes, like with her aid card. Now, once all the heroes have activated the requisite number of times, depending on the number of players, then it's the enemy phase. And when the enemy phase, each player, starting with the current leader, is going to have to choose an enemy to engage with, to activate. It should start with an enemy that's actually already engaged with you, an enemy that's actually in front of you. But if there isn't an enemy in front of you, you have to choose to engage one from the shadows, flip it over, and you'll have to deal with whatever its effect is. And I should also note that the ghoul here is going to inflict you with disease if that's the case. There are special status conditions, cards that you may have to deal with, like disease is going to force you to lose a success for every action that you do. And when an enemy is activated during this phase, it just deals this damage to you. There's really not much you can do about that unless you have a special ability or item or gear going on. The more enemies you have engaged with you, it doesn't matter, because you're only choosing 1 enemy to activate. And when an enemy activates, it exhausts, so that enemy's not going to be able to activate again on this round. Now, I mentioned gear cards before. We can talk a little bit about these. These are going to be items that you'll get from the gear deck that you can put in front of you and use in certain situations. So, for instance, the long sword here. Before your attack action, you may target 1 additional enemy. This target enemy must be in your engagement zone, so right in front of you. You have half plate. You can apply +4 to your health value. An iron shield. During your action, you may apply 1 success to apply 2 shields to your roll, and limit 1 shield per hero. Heroes all have gear capacities, by the way. In the first quest, you only have 1 spot, but then you may be able to get more during the settlement phase. And that's actually a good segue to talk about the last thing we're going to talk about, which is the settlement phase. Now, whether you succeed or fail at the mission, you're going to, well, you could retry the mission, but you might also just move on. And if you're doing the campaign mode, then you actually have something called the settlement phase. There's a couple of different things that are going to happen here. First off, let's talk about the campaign pool. If cards tell you to put cards into the campaign pool, that's like a separate area off to the side. And then in between games, when you're setting up for the new game, then you might have to do things. So for instance, any nemesis that you're forced to put into the campaign pool get shuffled into the new enemy deck. If there's dungeon cards that are in the campaign pool, you have to remove random dungeon cards from the new deck you're making for the new campaign quest, and then put those dungeon cards in the pool, shuffle those in. So there might be really nasty ones the campaign penalizes you and forces you to put into the deck. But also there's legendary fortune cards that you may shuffle into the gear deck, and that's going to be a beneficial thing for you. Those are actually these cards here. There's 3 different legendary fortune gear cards for every one of the heroes in the game. By the way, yes, there are 2 other heroes in the game. There's the Priest of Sigmar and the Elven Archer here. They have proper names, I forget it right now. Not like names, but like generic names. The Wayfarer, I think, is the Elven Archer. But they all have a set of 3 legendary items, which are like really, really powerful items compared to the other gear, and only certain special quest rewards are going to let you get those and shuffle them into the main gear deck, and then hopefully you're going to be able to find those randomly. The other major thing is getting your settlement actions. So there's not a ton I can show you here, but in addition to like refreshing all of your wounds and different things, players are going to have a chance to essentially either train, visit the blacksmith, or visit the arena. Now, if they choose to train, every character has 4 additional advanced action cards that they will use to replace. Those are the extra character cards for the different player accounts, but you will actually replace one of your basic action cards with one of these advanced action cards, and they're usually much better. They give you much more dice, they have more powerful effects, and so on. So one of your you have 2 actions to spend in the settlement action, and that can be one of them if you want, in between different campaign quests. Then you can also choose to go to the blacksmith, where you just draw 2 gear cards from the gear deck, choose one of them to equip, and then discard the other. And the other thing is that you can visit the arena in order to train and increase your gear capacity. So, which is important because you can only hold like 1 item at the start of the game, and you want to be able to hold more of them as time goes on, so you can hold more and more gear and get stronger and stronger. But you especially might want to do the gear action if there are legendary cards in the deck that you have the random chance of drawing. And if you are so inclined, there is a sheet that you can copy and print out that is a quest log. You'll keep track of how you did all the different quests and the different characters and where they currently are with their different types of actions and advancements. So that's a fairly quick but possibly too long run through of Warhammer Quest, the adventure card game. There's several other quests I, of course, didn't show you, and a special delve quest after the main campaign. But the whole point is you're essentially dungeon crawling through all these different quests consisting of different locations and different nemesis monsters and different randomized monsters, trying to gear up, get stronger, wipe out the different locations and monsters, and hopefully succeed on the quest and get rewards. Now, let's get to my final thoughts. Alright, well, we'll start off with the basic stuff, the theme and components. I think the theme is pretty strong here, especially if you read all the different story blurbs on the quest cards and even on the little dungeon cards. All these things help to steep you in the lore a bit more. The one thing I'm disappointed in is just that the characters are just generic. In other fantasy games, they actually have names, maybe even a little bit of backstory on the back of the card. There's nothing like that here. Maybe their expectation was you would actually roleplay a little bit and get into your character, make your own names for the characters, and yeah, that's fine, you can do that. The game doesn't really lend itself to doing that, though. It's really just more straightforward than that. There's not a lot of opportunities for you to role play out what you're doing unless you really force it. So I would have liked a little bit of assistance in there, making your characters distinct from any other character. Aside from, mechanically speaking, they're very distinct, but not like personality-wise. I flip this card, I roll these dice, you flip this card, you do something else completely different. Not flip, but turn. But there's not a lot of story elements there to explain what your motivation is. Maybe I'm reaching there, but that would have been nice. Otherwise, the artwork really lends itself well to the universe. Warhammer Fantasy is very grim and dark, and I think that the artwork is high quality, but also very grim and dark, so do be prepared to that. But I don't really have any problems in a major way with the theme. The components are all good, fantasy flight, quality, cardstock, all these different things. No real problems there. Going into the game mechanisms, the obvious comparison here that everyone wants to know about is how does this stack up to the Pathfinder adventure card game? And we can get into that, but the fact is, it's almost unfair to compare the two games because they're actually very different. The more appropriate comparisons are with two other games. The Lord of the Rings card game, also from Fantasy Flight, and surprisingly, Sentinels of the Multiverse. Now, the Sentinels tie-in is just in the fact that as you're playing the game, you'll have a card like an enemy pop out. It will go to someone who has either the most wounds, which is a hallmark of a lot of the characters in Sentinels of the Multiverse and the villains and how they react, and then they deal damage based on certain parameters. You're putting tokens on people, putting damage tokens on people and conditions, and all this like moving tokens around and moving cards around really reminded me of Sentinels, aside from the fact that you don't have a deck of cards that you're constantly drawing from for your own personal characters. It still gave me that Sentinels vibe in just that little way. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I love Sentinels of the Multiverse, but I was surprised that I had that feeling. With Lord of the Rings, the card game, that had the potential to be more problematic because I don't like Lord of the Rings, the card game. I did a review of it, and it was a negative review overall because I thought it was too dry, too fiddly. It was also had the LCG aspect of you having to construct the decks and big, long setup, and I just was not down for that. Fortunately, Warhammer Quest, the adventure card game, does away with a lot of the dry aspects of Lord of the Rings and has it be more dynamic. It's faster. You have all these sets of actions. You don't have to worry about building a deck ahead of time and constantly rereading and reading what cards do and looking at what your players' cards do. It's all relatively simple, and that's to its benefit. But the aspect that's really the same is going through the different locations, putting the progress tokens out. And that's a pretty interesting dynamic to the game. Because you have to make these decisions all the time, like, okay, I've got a bunch of enemies in front of me, up to 3 of them, and I really have to take care of them so that another one doesn't come out and really screw me over, but we really need to be making progress through these adventure locations. So where do my priorities lie? My friends might need my assistance. They should be helping me because I'm about to die over here. So there's a lot of different priorities to go on through, but you always have to be progressing through the quest, whatever that might entail. And, if quests where the big bad's going to be popping out and constantly haranguing you and just really making your life miserable. The game is very difficult. I was surprised by how difficult it is. I think that that's good, though. If it was too easy, that would hurt the replayability of the game. And I don't think that the replayability of the game otherwise is that bad because the scenarios are not like, this isn't like time stories type stories where you can just play them once and be like, oh, we've experienced the story, I guess that's it. It lends itself to replayability, and that's good. I mean, I think this is the type of game that I can just say, okay, you guys want to try Warhammer Adventure Card Game? Let's just bust it out and do the first campaign mission. No big deal. But because it is more difficult, I think that's going to give you more of a challenge, more incentive to play scenarios over and over again to get them done well. And if you're playing this in campaign mode, it's even better than that because you have you're able to make your characters better. Swapping out the whole actions is a very interesting concept, and also being the option to get more gear, but then having to worry about your gear spaces as well. It's interesting that you have these 3 options. You can only choose 2 of them. On top of any rewards you get from the campaign, you might get the legendary items, and that's super cool. So you do feel like you're making progress as you play through the game, but I would hesitate to say this is like an RPG in the box type game. It doesn't really have that much depth to it, which I would say is perhaps the game's biggest fault, is that anyone going into this expecting a very deep game might be a little bit disappointed. And here's where I'll start talking about the comparisons to Pathfinder Adventure Card Game. They feel like very, very different games mechanically speaking. Just the theme is very strong there. But if you do have to compare them, I think that the Pathfinder Adventure Card Game has a lot more depth to it. And that's just by its very nature. You have a deck of cards representing your character. This gets fleshed out. This gets cards added to it constantly. You can thin it out between missions and hone it down to what you want it to be. Cards get destroyed. Cards are your life. I mean, there's tons of different locations. You're exploring all these locations. There's a lot of stuff going on in the Pathfinder Adventure Card Game, and that gives it more of a strategic depth and more, I think, replay value, especially when you add in tons and tons of scenarios. The thing is, though, and this is where the pros and cons of each come into play, all of that makes Pathfinder Adventure Card Game a much more daunting game to get into, to play. I've never been able to just say, hey guys, I feel like playing Pathfinder Adventure Card Game. Let's just bust it out and play. Because then people were like, oh, well, I mean, are we playing with your characters that you've already built up, or are we starting fresh and we're all super weak? Then we're feeling like we're playing a partial game, and it's still very long, even if you are doing one of the early missions in that game. Whereas the Warhammer Quest adventure game, you can be like, hey, let's just bust it out, do a mission very quickly. And it's really easy to do that. And because the actual campaign missions can be fast, sometimes too fast if you die, because it is a hard game, I'll reiterate, you can actually do multiple campaign modes in a single night in a few hours. I mean, that's how fast the game plays once everyone knows what they're doing. That speed of gameplay is, I think, a huge benefit to Warhammer Quest. So I think there's pluses and minuses to both systems. I think I still like the Pathfinder adventure card game a little bit more because of that depth to it, and because the storyline comes out just a little bit more, I think, just a tiny bit more. I've certainly accused Pathfinder adventure card game of not being as thematic as it should be as well, but perhaps it's got a little bit of an edge in that area. I just think that they're very different, more than people might think. And I think, though, that if you are a fan of Lords of the Rings, a card game, if you are a fan of Sentinels, if you are a fan of Pathfinder adventure card game and want something a little less daunting, something you can just easily slide into, check out Warhammer Quest. I was impressed with it. I like it quite a bit. It's not the greatest thing ever, and I think it's not going to replace anyone's like big sprawling miniatures board games like Descent, as far as a dungeon crawler, but it's I think it certainly has its place. A lot of the individual mechanisms are a lot of fun. How you choose your different action cards, you aid each other. It is fully cooperative. You always have to be helping each other. You can attack other enemies with ranged attacks. I mean, every character feels very distinctive and unique, and all the different items you can get, exploring the dungeon, choosing to explore, all these different decisions feel very cool. So the game is very well designed. I was really impressed with it, and I think that you might be surprised. It's certainly not going to be what a lot of people expect, but that's not always a bad thing. That is Warhammer Quest, the adventure card game from Fantasy Flight Games. Do check it out. Thanks for watching. Follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Patreon. And make sure to check out our sponsor, Board Game Bliss, where you can find an amazing selection of games from around the world. BoardGameBliss.com. Thanks for your support.